I studied Marx until I lost sleep. I bowed before idols. I went to churches, read the Torah, recited Buddhist mantras, and still, I cried in the dark, asking myself, why doesn't any of this change me? When my best friend's mother was admitted to the ICU, and I spent the night alone on a cold bench staring at the ceiling, the only thing I could say was, God, if you truly exist, show me, because I can't keep fooling myself anymore. My name is Ravi Pranesh. I'm 55 years old, and I was born in India, in a traditional family where religion was more of an inheritance than a choice. I grew up surrounded by rituals, teachings, and fears. But none of those traditions answered the questions that burned inside me. I needed to know if there was one true God, and if it was possible to know him for real, without intermediaries, without illusions. Before I continue my story, leave a comment below letting me know which country you're watching this video from. I want to see how far this message is reaching, and if this topic touches your heart, subscribe to the channel now. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't common, but it's real. I wanted to change the world. I was young, idealistic, passionate about justice. And when I discovered communism, I clung to the promise of a fairer world, like someone finding solid ground in the middle of the sea. From each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. It sounded noble, almost sacred. But just a few years of engagement and deep reading were enough for the enchantment to wear off. I realized that behind the speeches, the same selfishness as always remained. I saw people using beautiful words to hide greed, pride, and a thirst for control. And I noticed a brutal flaw in the foundation of the theory. Communism assumes that human beings are good by nature, but that simply isn't true. If it were, the world would have fixed itself centuries ago, so I changed course. I went in search of something more spiritual. Buddhism attracted me with its serenity and its call to detachment. I studied books, practiced meditation, sought answers in silence. But the more I silenced the outside, the louder it got inside. The absence of certainty about God made me restless. How can I trust a path that isn't even sure there's a creator? How can I rest in a system that relativizes what should be absolute? That's when I began to crave something new, not just peace, but truth. A truth that didn't contradict itself, that wasn't manipulated by ideologies or cultural traditions. I wanted something that would feed the hunger of the soul, not just the doubts of the mind. I started looking into the Abrahamic religions, first Christianity, then Judaism. But even there I found inner conflicts, interpretations that changed from group to group, sects accusing each other, ideas that sounded to me too much like the polytheism I'd left behind. It was at this point of complete confusion that, without planning it, I ended up spending a night in the hospital where a friend's mother had been admitted. And there, between artificial breaths and the beeping of heart monitors, I asked the question that would change my life. Is there a true God? And if there is, why is he so hard to find? My friend arrived around 2 in the morning with a cup of coffee in his hand and tired eyes. He sat next to me in the ICU waiting room, looked at the glass door, and then turned to me as if he already knew something was eating me up inside. "Do you believe in God?" he asked directly without hesitation. I said yes, but hesitated. It was no longer a solid certainty. I came from a Hindu family, but I no longer believed in statues, in multiple gods, or in ceremonies. I said I believed in one God, but even I couldn't explain what that meant. I didn't pray. I just thought a lot. "And what exactly do you believe?" he pressed. I finally said what I had kept inside for so long, that I believed in one creator, who didn't need intermediaries or images, that this God had to be pure, sovereign, and just, and if he was real, I wanted to find him, but not through priests, gurus, or monks. I wanted truth, not representation. He was silent for a moment, then smiled calmly. "You just described Islam, the Islam almost no one knows. I admit I frowned. My image of Islam was distorted. I associated it with conflict, extremism, restrictions. And then he said something that completely disarmed me. You're judging the religion based on the behavior of those who practice it poorly. But tell me something. When a car crashes, do you blame the car or the driver? The metaphor hit me hard. For the first time, I felt like maybe I had been committing an injustice, not against people, but against the very idea of God. He came back the next day with 2 friends. And there, in the hospital cafeteria, between cold plates and muffled voices, they explained to me what the oneness of Allah meant, that God is one, without partners, without children, without images, that no one can represent God, not even through art or ideas, that he sees everything, hears everything, knows everything, and that speaking to him doesn't require ritual, it requires surrender. I went home that night with more questions than answers, but something had changed. For the first time in years, I was no longer trying to understand God. I was beginning to listen to him. The next morning, before even having coffee, I opened the envelope with the 3 books my friend had left for me. One had a title that didn't catch my attention. The other looked like a novel, but the third, The Life of Prophet Muhammad, caught my eye immediately. I started reading without high expectations. After all, how many religious leaders had I already studied? All with their biographies, their followers, their mythical stories. But with Muhammad, it was different. There was no gold, no temples, no crowns. There was desert, rejection, struggle, and a man who cried at night for the very people who hated him during the day. Each page revealed someone who spoke with firmness, but never with arrogance. Someone who had every chance to seek power, but chose simplicity. Who could have taken revenge, but forgave. Who taught men to wash their hands, care for their wives, and treat orphans as their own children, in a time when all of that was seen as weakness. That's when the armor around my heart began to crack. Because I was looking at a figure who was real, historical, and yet so deeply human. And it was in that humanity that I found myself crying. Not out of sadness, but out of confrontation. Because I realized how much I had hardened. How I had rejected God because of the failures of religion, but had never given revelation a real chance. I stopped reading, closed the book, got up and walked around the house like someone escaping an invisible fire. That name, Muhammad, kept echoing in my mind like an unending drumbeat. That night, I returned to the book, and in the following pages, I came to understand what the Quran was. I learned about the cave of Hira, and most importantly, I understood that Islam wasn't a religion invented by men. It was an answer, sent to hearts like mine, hearts tired of myths, hearts hungry for truth. I hadn't taken the Shahada yet. I didn't even know how to pray. But inside me, something had already surrendered, and it was in that broken silence that faith began to be born. I spent the next few days in a state I can't quite explain. It wasn't euphoria, it wasn't fear either. It was as if everything inside me was reorganizing. I walked more slowly, spoke less, observed more, but above all, I listened. I listened to something that didn't come from outside, but also didn't come only from my mind. It was as if, for the first time, I was truly ready to hear God. I remember exactly the moment I stopped in front of my bedroom window. The sun was beginning to set, and the city had that muffled late afternoon sound. I closed my eyes and said, out loud, though still formless, "If you are real, show me how to find you." I didn't know that was already a supplication. I didn't know that in Islam, this kind of sincere cry is seen as a dua, an intimate invocation. I only knew that after that, something began to change. A few days later, I met my friend again. I told him about the reading, the tears, this new desire to speak to God directly. He listened with respect and simply said, "You're already praying, even if you don't realize it yet. Then he paused and asked me a simple question. If you believe God is one, if you believe he is perfect, without partners, without image, and without limits, why haven't you surrendered to him yet? I was speechless, because deep down, I had already surrendered. I just didn't know how to express it. That's when he explained the Shahada to me, the declaration of faith. It wasn't a ritual, it was a commitment, a key, a personal pact with the Creator. All I had to do was sincerely say, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadur Rasulullah, and everything would change. He didn't pressure me. He simply said that when the heart is ready, the tongue will know what to say. That night, alone in my room, I whispered the words. No witnesses, no audience, just me and God. And when I finished, the silence was no longer empty. It was peace. The next day, I went out for my usual walk. The streets were the same, the sky the same. People were as rushed as ever, but something inside me felt anchored. I can't explain it in ordinary words. It wasn't a strong emotion nor a chill. It was more subtle, as if an invisible presence was walking beside me, as if a quiet light had been lit inside my chest, and for some reason I knew I was no longer alone. I walked past the small newspaper shop where I always bought my coffee. The clerk greeted me just like always, but for the first time I noticed I wasn't in a hurry. I thanked him calmly. I felt the value of that gesture. It was as if everything around me had lowered its volume, and my soul, for the first time in years, was listening to its own frequency. That afternoon, I reread the book about the life of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, each page seemed to speak directly to me. Every difficulty he faced, the rejection, the mockery, the loneliness, reflected parts of my own story. But what struck me even more deeply than the challenges he endured was the way he responded to them, with patience, with prayer, with absolute trust in a God he never saw, but whom he felt at every step. And that's when I understood that what had happened to me wasn't just a change of belief. It was surrender. That night, I called the same friend and said, I made the Shahada yesterday, alone. He stayed silent for a few seconds. Then he replied, You weren't alone. We cried together on the phone, and in that moment, something was sealed between us, not a friendship, but a brotherhood. In the following days, I began studying the daily prayers. I tried to pronounce everything correctly. I stumbled over the words, but I was determined. Every sujood I learned reminded me of my first invisible prostration, the one no one saw, but that changed everything. I didn't tell my family. I didn't post anything. I didn't argue with anyone. But in that small room in New Delhi, a 55-year-old man discovered that silence, when guided by truth, can be more powerful than 1,000 speeches. Faith was new, but the world around me remained the same. The first question came from my brother during a Sunday lunch. You've been very quiet lately. Did something happen? I replied with a vague smile. But he insisted, and then I realized what had changed in me was already being noticed, not through rituals, but through atmosphere. I started avoiding certain conversations. I declined invitations to family religious events. I stopped participating in traditional rituals. And each of my actions was met with doubtful looks, whispered comments, and gradually distance. My older sister was the first to confront me directly. You've turned away from our faith, haven't you? I hesitated. I wanted to find words that wouldn't wound, but deep down, I knew there was no explanation that could fit into the span of a single conversation. I simply replied, I found something that brought me peace. That's all. Her reaction was a mix of disappointment and contempt, as if my search for God were a personal betrayal, as if choosing another path meant rejecting the people who love me. But how can you explain to someone who never had to fight to believe? How can you talk about an invisible transformation to someone who only sees the external? The sideways glances began, the invitations that never came, the feeling of being a stranger in your own home. During that time, what sustained me were the early hours before dawn. I would wake before sunrise, perform my ablutions carefully, unroll the prayer mat in the right direction, and even without mastering Arabic, I would pray. Not with perfect phrases, but with my whole heart. Each rak'ah was like an anchor, each sujood a refuge. It was there, in that small room, that I became whole again. I began corresponding with Muslims from other countries. I found brothers in faith whom I've never met in person, but who understood me better than my own family. People who knew what it meant to leave everything behind to follow the truth. It was during that period that I learned one of the hardest lessons of my conversion. The path to God is narrow and often lonely. But in every step taken with sincerity, there is an invisible companionship, a support the world cannot see, but the soul recognizes. My heart already believed, but my mind still wanted to understand. I knew I had found something precious, but I didn't want to rely only on emotion. I needed to know why it was true, and not just a new shelter for my wounded soul. I began studying more seriously. I read about the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. I discovered how he treated his enemies, how he cared for the poor, how he lived every word he preached. And I couldn't find a single inconsistency. Every gesture he made carried the weight of a mission, and at the same time, the lightness of someone who knows they walk with purpose. What struck me most was the simplicity of Tawheed, the oneness of God. No intermediaries, no images, no favors bargained with minor deities, only one God. Absolute, perfect, without form, without son, without rival, a God who created everything and needs nothing. That's when something changed. Until then, I had just been exploring Islamic faith. But at that point I understood. It was no longer an exploration. It was a conviction. I began studying the Quran with the mind of someone ready to question, and the heart of someone ready to obey. And that's when I discovered something remarkable. The text didn't demand blind faith. It invited me to reflect. Verse after verse, the Quran challenged me to use my reason. Do they not observe the heavens? Do they not reflect upon the signs on the earth? Do they not think about the creation within themselves? With every reading, my certainty grew. Islam didn't numb me. It woke me up. I didn't need dogmas hidden behind mystery. I didn't need to believe in ancient sacrifices to be accepted. The only requirement was conscious submission to the Creator of all things, and for the first time, everything made sense. It happened one hot afternoon in a small cafe on the outskirts of Hyderabad. I was with two old university friends. We talked about politics, economics, religion. One of them, while commenting on extremism around the world, said with a certain disdain, "Those Muslims need to learn how to live in the 21st century." The sentence hung in the air. I could have stayed silent as I had so many times before, but something inside me no longer allowed silence. I took a deep breath, looked at them both, and said, "I am Muslim." One of them laughed, thought it was a joke. The other froze and asked, "What do you mean?" "Since when?" "Since the day I understood that God needs no intermediaries, and that my soul has never felt so free." The silence lasted longer than the conversation. After that meeting, the phone calls stopped. The messages disappeared. The jokes came disguised as concern. A mutual friend wrote to say I seemed confused and maybe I should get help. But what they didn't know was I was more sane than I had ever been. I began quietly attending the local mosque. There I met a small group of brothers who welcomed me without judgment, without interrogation. None of them asked if I was formally Hindu, Christian, or atheist. They only asked if I was willing to learn and to pray. It was there that I realized something powerful. In Islam, identity isn't built on labels, but on actions. And in that quiet mosque, among simple men with clean hearts, I felt, finally, at home. I stopped trying to convince others, because now I had conviction within me. And when you find the truth, you no longer need approval from those who still live in illusion. It wasn't a conversation. It wasn't a miracle. Not even a supernatural sign. What convinced me was the quiet consistency of truth. Today, I no longer need to prove anything, not to myself, not to others. I wake before sunrise, perform my ablutions calmly, and when I place my forehead on the ground, alone on my prayer mat, I understand what freedom really means. Freedom from needing statues, gurus, icons, or theories. Freedom from carrying old questions, because I found the oldest answer of all. La ilaha illallah. Yes, I'm still criticized. Yes, some family members have distanced themselves. And yes, there are days when the path is lonely, but inside me, there is silence, there is order, there is a purpose no ideology ever gave me. God's words are now part of my daily life, not as an obligation, but as sustenance. When I read the Quran, I don't see another religion. I see the restoration of everything I always sought: purity, justice, uprightness, and the certainty that the Creator knows me better than I know myself. I'm not perfect. I'm still learning. I still make mistakes, but for the first time I know where to return when I fall. And that path doesn't require intermediaries. It's open, direct, clear, between me and the one who created me. I had to pass through philosophies, religions, disappointments, and silence, but now I understand. None of it was wasted. It was all part of the journey. A journey that taught me that truth doesn't shout. It endures. And that's why today I no longer seek the right religion. I live in submission to the only one worthy of worship. This is Islam. There are paths we choose, and there are others that seem to choose us. If you've listened to this testimony all the way through, maybe it's because deep down, you too are searching for something greater. Something no ideology, system, or guru has been able to satisfy. And if that's the case, know this: you are not alone. What I found in Islam was not an escape. It was a return. It wasn't a new religion. It was the rediscovery of an ancient truth, pure and alive. It doesn't matter where you come from. What matters is where your soul is being called. If this video touched you in any way, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me which city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far this message is reaching, because I know that the truth always finds those who have the courage to seek it. May Allah guide you, strengthen you, and reveal to you what no book alone can teach. The certainty that is born when the heart prostrates. Not before symbols, but before the Creator. Assalamu alaikum.